I welcome you all to the module 9 of this course. So, the module 9 is about social and cultural aspects to personality. So, this is the second lecture of this module and overall it is lecture number 20. So, today's lecture is about understanding the connection between the culture and personality. So, we will discuss about various aspects of culture and how it can influence human personality and so on. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture, which was also a part of this module. It was on gender and personality. So, in that lecture we discussed the conceptual the difference between the concept of sex and concept of gender. We discussed the gender is more of a socially constructed idea and sex is more of a biological idea between male and female. We also talked about various assessment process of gender, which may include multiple combination of masculinity and femininity and so on. We also talked about various historical background in terms of how the research in the context of gender and personality evolved, and then we discussed what are the factual differences between men and women in terms of personality and what are the kind of fictional things, mostly stereotypical concepts. We kind of looked through the research findings and so on. We also looked at more specific aspect of gender and personality in the context of aggression, in the context of risk taking behavior, in the context of leadership style and so on. So, these are some of the things that we discussed. So, in today's lecture we will be focusing on the culture and personality aspects. We will be looking at different approaches to study personality and culture. We will talk about the why it is so important to study cross cultural differences in personality. We will be also looking at the various approaches in understanding the relationship between culture and personality, and at the end we will be talking about the cultural differences in the concept of self-construal. So, these are some of the things that we will be discussing in today's lecture. So, let us start today's lecture. So, before we talk about the connection between the culture and personality, let me give you a brief background or kind of definition of what is culture is all about. So, culture as a term is very difficult and very challenging term to define, because there are so many conceptions around it. For example, in 1952, American anthropologist Kroeber and Cluckhorn conducted a critical review of various concepts and definition of culture, and they could kind of compile about 164 distinct definitions of culture. So, some of these definitions are given here. For example, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So, culture is a kind of collection of all these things that is included here, like knowledge, belief, art, moral, law, customs, etc., which are acquired by people in a society. Culture is also defined as a collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the member of one group or category from another. So, whatever the collective programming as a group of individual they have, and it distinguishes one group from another group. So, basically that is the culture. So, another definition is culture encompasses the beliefs, customs, art, traditions of a society transmitted through language and social reinforcement of behavior. So, if you see, most of these definitions are talking about same thing only in a different ways. So, the idea is its culture includes all kinds of beliefs, morals, laws, customs, practices, rituals, whatever is collectively done by a group of people, that becomes a part of culture. And generally when we talk about a culture, so its units can vary. So, we can talk about culture in a very small group. It may include things like culture of a family also. It could include things like culture of a society, culture of a group, culture of a region, culture of a country. We can also talk about global culture and so on. So, the idea is units of culture could differ from a very small unit to a larger unit. So, depending on what is the focus of defining culture. So, like this, basically when collectively a group of people believe in something, certain customs, rituals, practices, which distinguishes them from another group of people, that constitutes what culture is all about. Now, culture, how this whole group level phenomena could be connected to the concept of personality. So, as we have already discussed earlier also, that personality is a product of both genetic contribution as well as environmental factors. So, personality is contributed by whatever the personality we all have is basically contributed by one's genetic contribution, whatever the information we get through the genes from our parents and ancestors. So, that also contributes to kind of person we become, as well as a lot of environmental factor as we progress in our life. The influence of other people, influence of environment in which we live in also influences our personality and shapes our personality. Now, when we talk about culture, it is a part of these environmental factors. Culture is basically constituted under environmental factors. So, culture in which we live is one of the most important environmental factor, because culture influences the kind of environment that we are in, which could differ from different cultures. So, since culture determines a lot of environmental factors, so since environment can influence our personality factors, so culture can influence our personality factors. So, this is one of the basic idea behind why culture should be studied in the context of personality. So, the personality psychologists have increasingly recognized the significant role of culture in shaping personality. So, with the progress of research, more recently, the psychologists are focusing on understanding the cultural influence. Earlier focus was more on studying factors that are universal, considered universal. Now, a lot of psychologists are looking at cultural influences and cross-cultural differences in terms of personality factors. The cultural milieu influences individuals' personality by modeling acceptable, unacceptable behaviors. So, culture determines what is acceptable, what is unacceptable behavior, what is rewarded, what is punished. All this will mold the kind of person we become. So, that is one of the important kind of mechanism that can be connected to personality and culture. Researchers in personality psychology are investigating whether personality traits are consistent across culture or exhibit variations. So, the focus of cultural psychologists in the context of personality is that are there only universal traits in personality, or there are cultural differences in terms of expression of traits and so on. So, this is one of the main objectives of cultural psychologists in terms of understanding personality. So, we will see some of these findings. So, it is observed that there are no doubt there are certain universal aspects to personality traits. So, certain traits are there which are kind of universally found across all cultures. There are also culture specific influences that contribute to differences in personality among people from different cultural background. So, there are universal aspects to personality traits, and there are culture specific influences which also contribute to differences in the personality among people of different cultural background. People are different because of certain cultural influences. So, both the aspects are there and we will see them. So, this recognition underscores the complexity of understanding personality. So, personality complex factors could play a role in terms of shaping personality, and one such factors is cultural factors. So, why should we study cultural factors in the context of personality? So, it is very important for certain reasons. One is, as proposed by some researcher, Benet and Oishi, that Western ideas about personality may not be universally applied to other cultures. So, because researcher, as they are studying diverse cultural cultures, more and more research are getting published from other cultures, people are realizing that a lot of the Western ideas about personality may not hold true in other cultures. So, there is a need to understand personality in the context of other cultures. So, different societies have distinct norms, values and socialization practices that shape how personality traits are expressed and valued. So, because of these factors that differentiate groups of different cultures could shape personality in a different ways. So, we cannot ignore these cultural nuances which can lead to misunderstanding and misinterpretation of personality across different cultural contexts if you just impose Western ideas on other people. So, that is why it is important to study this. Another factor, a lot of research on big 5 factors or trait factors that we already discussed in detail. Big 5 personality factors which include openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness and neuroticism. So, this we have already discussed in the earlier modules. These big 5 factors or traits demonstrate that while there are universal aspects to these traits, their expression and relative importance can vary significantly across cultures. So, this trait have been found in diverse cultures. So, that means there is a, so in that sense there is an universal aspects to this big 5 factors or traits. They are kind of found in all cultures, but how these traits gets expressed, which trait gets more prominence, which one is more relatively important in which culture. Now, those differences, nuances are there in different cultures. So, culture could differ in terms of which trait is expressed more, which trait gets more importance and so on. So, even though these traits are present in all cultures, how they are expressed could be different depending on cultures. So, and so that is why even in the universal factors, factors which are universally applicable in different cultures, their expression could be different in different cultures. So, that is why so for example, some of the study shows that culture that emphasizes collectivism may prioritize agreeableness and conscientiousness. So, we will be talking about this, what is collectivism culture actually, culture could be categorized based on their characteristics. So, collectivism basically we will also looking at in the upcoming slide also, which basically talks about culture which focuses more on relationship, group or harmony and so on. So, such kind of cultures, traits like agreeableness and conscientiousness may play more important role and may get more expressed and given more importance, where some cultures which are individualism, where focus on individual achievement, individual focus is given more importance, individual aspects as compared to the group level connection and so on. In those cultures might emphasize trait like extroversion and openness to experiences. So, among these 5 traits, 5 factors, depending on the nature of or characteristics of the culture, some traits may get more prominence in certain cultures and other factors may get more prominence in other cultures. So, like that there can be cultural differences within the same trait expression of traits. So, like this, so in this essence, understanding cultural influences on personality allows psychologists to develop more comprehensive and accurate models of personality as compared to when we are studying only one model of personality based on data of one particular culture like Western countries and so on. So, in order to better account diversities of human behavior and experiences, cross cultural studies are very important. It also encourages nuanced approach that respects and integrate cultural differences. So, that is also very important to understand more the diverse expression of personality within people of different cultures. Now, there have been various approaches to study personality and culture. 2 most prominent approaches are culture comparative approach, which basically means cross cultural comparisons are made. This is one approach where you study certain variables in different cultures and then make certain comparison. So, cultural comparison approach and then see whether they are same or different and so on. Another is the indigenous approach, which talks about more of studying only from the perspective of that culture, rather than start with some already defined model and then study. Then it kind of start from the bottom up approach, where you study the culture from their perspective only. So, that is called indigenous approach. So, let us see what are these in more detail about these 2 approaches. So, in the culture comparative approach, the personality psychology aims to evaluate the generalizability and cultural validity of Western based theories and assessment of personality across different cultures, because a lot of these models evolved in the Western countries. So, they try to implement and see whether those models are valid in other cultures or not. So, they make comparison by collecting data using those models and assessment tools and so on. So, this approach involves testing whether concepts and measures developed in Western context apply similar to non-Western context. So, whether they are applicable or not, whether similar patterns are observed in other culture or not. For instance, researchers like McRae and Costa, who developed and did lot of research in the context of Big 5 trait model, have conducted studies demonstrating the stability and applicability of Big 5 personality traits across diverse cultural settings. So, they did lot of research and tried to compare whether these 5 factor models are there in different cultures or not, and they found lot of validity and stability of these 5 factors across different cultures. So, this is an example how cultural comparative approach studies personality across cultures. The next one is the indigenous approach, which basically it emerged from the limitation of applying Western based personality assessment in non-Western cultures. So, a lot of researcher found that when we start with Western model and then we see whether it is applicable or not. So, that means we are already conceptualizing things and ideas and theories from the Western perspective and then we are trying to apply it. So, indigenous approach found this is a limited approach, because you are starting with already a certain concepts which are developed in other culture, then you are trying to see it. So, that may not hold that will have a limitation in terms of because the concepts are already kind of set up from other cultures. So, it acknowledges that Western model may not fully capture the complexities and diversities of personality constructs across different cultural contexts. So, this model may not be in the first place, may not kind of capture essence of other cultures. So, we need to develop theories and assessment from those cultural perspective. We need to develop a new concepts or new understanding and theories and assessment processes which are applicable in that culture, rather than starting with the things and theories and assessment developed in other cultures. So, that is the indigenous approach. So, the indigenous approach advocates for developing personality assessment instruments that are grounded in the specific cultural values, norms and construct relevant to the culture being studied. So, this context, this particular approach, they develop theories and assessment processes from a particular cultural perspective only, and then they kind of focus only on that culture, understanding that culture, rather than taking Western models and then looking at. So, that is the difference between indigenous approach and culture comparative approach. So, this particular indigenous approach led to significant advancement, including translation of lot of personality assessment tools, validation or kind of adaptation of tools from the perspective of other cultures, which tools into various languages and cultural frameworks, as well as integration of indigenous perspective and personality. So, a lot of research also went into that direction. So, by incorporating local cultural views and understanding of personality development, researcher can create more culturally sensitive and value assessment. So, the idea is to develop things, models and assessment instruments which are more culturally sensitive. So, that is the approach of indigenous theories. So, this approach not only enriches our understanding of personality across cultures, but also promotes inclusivity and respect for diverse cultural perspective in psychological research. So, this is just an example that was done from the indigenous perspective research, for example, done by Burak and colleagues in 2019, which tries to understand the complex and diverse nature of indigenous identity and the significant impact of historical and contemporary factors on personality development within Canadian indigenous communities. So, this is an example of study how it was done from the indigenous perspective. So, basically these researchers were trying to understand Canadian indigenous communities from their cultural perspective. They were trying to understand how their identities are formed, what are the historical and contemporary factors shape their personality and personality development. So, in that context they also studied their trauma they faced in the history, indigenous peoples of Canada because of colonization, oppression, forced displacement and displacement from their traditional lands and attempts at cultural assimilation. So, all these historical traumatic factors, how they shape their identity and shape their personality, they were trying to understand from their perspective. So, this history includes severe abuses such as forced relocation, family separation and so on, which aimed at erase indigenous cultural identity. So, they were tried, there are a lot of factors which historical traumatic factors, they tried to kind of alienate them from their own cultural identity and so on. And all these factors impacted their personality development. So, this collective trauma experienced by as a group by indigenous communities, including intergenerational effects, plays a crucial role in the shaping of their personality development. These experiences influence how individuals perceive themselves, their identity and their place within the community and the broader society. So, this is an example of a study which was done from the indigenous perspective. They were only interested into understanding how their cultural factors shaping their personality. So, the importance of cross cultural difference, we have already touched upon some of the things. So, here it is a little bit more elaborate on this. So, until recently basically psychologists largely ignored these cross cultural issues because of certain issues in terms of you cannot study too many cultures and there were issues earlier. So, most of the psychologists were focusing on collecting data from the sample who are available in their own cultures. So, not much importance was given in terms of studying people from different cultures. So, this neglect has been mostly benign, as psychologists have focused on describing and explaining phenomena based on the people they can most easily study. So, people who can be most easily studied, people in their own culture around them. So, people were studying mostly this kind of samples. So, because of these practical issues, people were not really looking at whether this is valid in other cultures or not. For example, people like Freud concentrated on Viennese women without much concern from cross cultural differences. He was studying people from the Viennese country and without really focusing whether these things will be applicable to people in other cultures or not. Similarly, European and North American psychologists have primarily conducted research within the Western cultural context, focusing on individual differences, perception, cognition and behavioral change. Most of these people, European countries and Western countries, they were focusing on findings from people from their cultures. So, that was the trend because that was easily accessible and practically more feasible for them. However, this research has been sufficiently, obviously a lot of interesting findings were discovered from that only. However, this cross cultural differences and emphasis and the evolution of cultural psychology has recently been kind of progressing, and as a result more and more data from other cultures are coming to compare with and so on. However, this kind of approach of focusing only on one culture was becoming less sustainable as research expanded. As I said, with the relatively recently the research has expanded from many other cultures. Researches have been published in from many other cultures. So, slowly people are realizing that the people from other cultures could that factors and traits could be much different. For example, the Surgeon General of United States had officially recognized that culture counts in understanding mental health and disorders, interventions and risk factors. So, even Western countries are now focusing that when we focus on dealing with mental health, disorders, treatments, intervention, cultural factor has to be looked at. You cannot give a generalized treatment to everybody or generalized diagnosis for everybody. Some cultural unique aspects could also contribute to all these factors, and that has to be focused on. Psychologists are increasingly interested in cross cultural differences for primarily three reasons. One is to enhance international understanding, because now it is a global, because of this globalization, we all know about other people and people are getting more in contact with each other. So, understanding international people from diverse countries and cultures is becoming much more important, because the interaction and connection is increasing in today's world. Second is to assess the applicability of psychology to people around worldwide. So, one can give theories and grand theories from a particular cultural perspective, but whether such theories are applicable in other culture or not, it is very important to look at those things. Applicability of those concepts, whether they are applicable in other cultures or people in the worldwide, one has to kind of, it is the demand of the time to understand that, to appreciate the diverse varieties of human experience. Cultural understanding is important simply because we need to appreciate the diversity of human behavior and experiences. It is only through the different cultural study we can understand those diversities. Now, there have been historically various approaches in understanding the relationship between culture and personality. We will look at a few such approaches, how they evolved. So, mostly anthropologists began using psychological concept to explore origins, cultural development, social customs, beliefs of social groups. So, a lot of these cultural aspects were mostly studied by anthropologists, but anthropologists also kind of looked at psychological concepts like personality and so on, and they also kind of included those understanding in their research. All this exploration, the connection of anthropologist to the psychologist, has led to many approaches in understanding the relationship between culture and personality. So, all these approaches actually helped or kind of gave much more insights in understanding the role of culture and personality and so on. Some of these approaches include the configurationalist approach, national characteristic approach, personality and national culture, the work of Hofstede. So, we will look at these three approaches in terms of how research evolved from the cultural perspective. So, configurationalist approach is basically one of the earliest school of thought in psychological anthropology, which tried to look at personality from cultural aspects, which developed in 1920s. Mostly anthropologists like Edward Sapir and American academician like Ruth Benedict and his student Margaret Mead. So, these are the people who are mostly involved in this approach, in the configurationalist approach, where they try to look at personality from cultural perspective. So, this approach basically says that culture embodies the collective personality of its member. So, when we talk about culture, it is basically nothing else but the collective personality of all the members of that particular culture. It says that all members of a society share similar characteristics through a cultural interconnected by symbolism and interpretation of their world. So, most of this culture, when we talk about, they have kind of similar personality characteristics because they are all interconnected to each other through various symbolism and interpretation of their world are very similar. So, all members of society share very similar characteristics. So, culture is basically collective personality. So, this shared structure from a culture type driven by common ideas and belief. So, all this shared structure because of so that is the cultural type which distinguishes one culture from another and which also says the characteristics of that culture. For researcher, from this perspective, culture, personality and culture are inseparable, with the former being the reflection of the latter. So, these are all, both these two aspects, personality, culture, are inseparable to each other. One is the reflection of another. So, these are like not separate constructs. If you understand culture, you know they are personalities of the people in that culture. So, one is the reflection of the other. They argue that understanding individuals within a society is key understanding that society as a whole. So, if you understand the individuals in that society, you can understand the society as a whole. So, that means, if you understand the personality of people in a culture, you can understand the whole cultural, the collective personality of that particular culture. So, each individual represents microcosm of the culture they inhabit. So, that is why so they all share similar characteristics. Consequently, the difference between culture are seen as difference between the personality types of the individual within each society. Two cultures are different because people in that two cultures are different. So, if you study people in a culture, we can understand the characteristics of the culture also. So, the Ruth Benedict's study of, for example, from this perspective, they studied different tribal cultures. She identified the general culture of particular societies by examining the personalities of individual within those cultures. So, that was the approach, because if you study the individuals, characteristics of individuals or personalities of the individuals in a culture, you can kind of make sense of what this culture is all about. So, one such study was done by Ruth Benedict from this perspective. For example, she studied Pueblo Indians who lived in villages in northwestern New Mexico. These are basically tribal people. So, Benedict she tried to study these people, characteristics of these people, and then she said what is the characteristics of their culture. So, Benedict characterized their culture as Apollonian, which exhibits characteristics like there is a clarity, harmony and restraint in the behavior of the people. People avoided strong emotions. People were not allowed to show individual assertiveness, and people prioritize cooperation over personal gain, especially in upholding group traditions. These are the characteristics she found are common among individuals of that culture. So, these are the traits or characteristics of people which defines the characteristics of the culture also of that group. So, this is one approach where a small groups are studied in terms of with the idea that people are reflection of the culture. So, if you study characteristics or personalities of the people, you know the culture, or if you know the cultural characteristics, you can understand the characteristics of the people. So, this was one of the approach. Now, the same people who gave this configurationalist approach, they also expanded their study to larger groups, which became the concept or the approach of national character, study of national character. So, this was the another approach in the study of culture and personality, which emerged from investigation into national character. So, Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, who kind of studied this configurationalist approach, they also expanded their study into national character approach. So, initially they, as we have already discussed, they studied personality and culture in small scale societies such as tribal groups. However, as their career progressed, they began to analyze the national character of more complex societies or larger societies, and the shift that was particularly influenced by global context of World War II. So, because of the World War II, people could know the characters of the national or the countries, what kind of people are in a particular country, because when they get involved into war, people get to know the larger entities or a country. So, from that they actually progressed to study national character of various countries. So, that became basically an approach to study national character. So, during the war, differences between nations were very evident, starkly highlighted, prompting anthropologists to describe and explain national character of countries like Japan, Germany and USA, because they are all involved in the war. So, that led to the studying of such whole countries, characters or characteristics or culture of the countries together. So, for example, in her book, is one of the books that she wrote, Chrysanthemum and the Sword in 1946, Ruth Benedict studied Japanese culture during wartime, and she characterized the Japanese as a culture, or Japan as a country embodies the contradiction between fanatical militarism and restrained aestheticism. These are like her own way of observations and studying larger group like a country. Similarly, some other people also tried, based on their observation, they tried to make national culture and commented on a culture of a particular country. For example, Erich Fromm, who was a very celebrated psychologist and from the tradition of psychoanalysis, in his book Escape from Freedom in 1941, speculated on the German national character, particularly questioning why the German people submitted to Hitler. Erich Fromm described Germans as having an authoritarian personality marked by obedience and subservience to superiors and cruelty to subordinates. This was all based on what was happening during the war. So, they kind of gave characteristics of a country. Later, Margaret Mead along with Matrox explored the French national characters in their 1953 book Themes in French Culture, emphasizing traits of intellectual and emotional control. So, like this, some people tried to study whole country, characteristics of a country. So, that was the approach called national character approach in terms of studying culture and personality. However, a lot of this research from this national culture perspective were criticized by many researchers because of their poor methodology. In the earlier work, this whole configurationalist approach was very simple and they were focusing only on small tribes. So, it was much more productive in terms of understanding those small tribes, provided ethnographic accounts which involved detailed fieldwork to describe these tribal groups. So, this approach was more successful among small societies like hunter-gatherer communities and tribes and so on, allowed for a straightforward analysis of their rituals, religious practices and so on. So, in those studies were much more powerful and detailed analyses were done. So, those studies were much more methodologically much more rigorous. However, when they and other people started examining larger and complex societies like whole country, industrial countries like Japan, Germany, France, there were many problems. This ethnographic approach proved insufficient for these modern societies, which were too complex to reduce to simple themes or derived from fieldwork. So, it is very difficult to study a whole country, you can just make some conclusion based on some observed things of certain patterns, but you cannot have a detailed ethnographic accounts of a whole country, because this is too big and complex as a society, and whole country is not one thing, there could be many things within the country. So, such approaches were criticized because because it is too large entity in terms of giving an ethnographic account for such kind of whole country level analysis. So, the complexity of the societies meant that a more nuanced and multifaceted approach will be needed to accurately capture the national character, which was not there in these approaches. So, that was one of the issue with this lot of these findings. Now, in this direction also certain studies from national culture, some people tried to do some other studies like McRae and Terracciano from the National Institute on Aging in the US, Maryland, US, conducted a study on national character, which was relatively recently in 2006, and explored where the perception of a nation's character matched the personalities of individuals within that nation. So, that was the objective of their study. So, people have certain perception about their countries, characteristics of their countries, whether that perception matches with their own personalities or not. So, that was they were trying to understand in this particular research. So, they again use 5-factor model or traits of personality from their research, which unfolded mostly in 2 stages. So, stage 1, they measured individuals' perception of their national character using national character survey developed by Terracciano. This survey asked respondent to judge a hypothetical typical member of their culture across 30 bipolar scales corresponding to this 5-factor model. So, certain traits were given, bipolar traits, and they were asked what is the characteristics of a typical person of your country or of your cultures, what is your perception. So, they gave certain ratings. In the second stage, they compared this perception with participants' own personality assessment. Then all these participants are also asked to assess their own personality or rate their own personality through the same 5-factor trait questionnaire, which measure their own personality factors. And so, they are saying whether this matches or not, their perception of people in their culture and their own personality, whether it matches or not. So, this study analyzes a large scale study over 4,000 individuals from 49 countries, including Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, UK, Germany, France, Spain, New Zealand, Russia, US, India and Italy and so on. So, it is a very large scale study, included diverse countries and cultures. All these scales were translated into different languages as necessary. The researcher then compared the national character survey data with the personality inventory or traits. So, the finding of this study showed a varied correlation between national character perceptions and the actual personality traits. They found there were different findings from different countries. For example, some samples such as those from Poland, Lebanon and Australia displayed medium to large positive correlation for these countries. So, there was a medium kind of positive correlation between their own personality and the perception of their country's people. So, there was some positive correlation. However, some other countries like UK, Denmark, Belgium showed medium to large negative correlation. That means, there was their own perception and their own characteristics were opposite to each other. So, they were not correlated positively, they were correlated negatively. However, they found overall most of the findings shows most of this correlation were very low actually between the perception of their country's characteristics and their own personality characteristics, with an average correlation of 0.02, which is very less, it is almost negligible, indicating that individuals' personality profiles generally did not align with their perception of typical cultures. So, they have a certain perception, but they always rated themselves as different from that perception. For example, US respondent perceives typical US citizen to be higher in neuroticism and lower in agreeableness. So, these are two traits of 5-factor model, such as emotional, anxious, depressive, self-conscious and less warm, trustful, all these typical character traits. However, when rating themselves, US individuals were on average much lower on neuroticism and higher on agreeableness. So, when they rated themselves in a much different way. So, they rated that they perceive the typical US citizen is higher on neuroticism, lower on agreeableness, but when they rated themselves as much low in neuroticism and high in agreeableness, just opposite to what is their perception of general people in their culture. Conversely, for example, Canadian viewed their national character as lower in neuroticism and higher in agreeableness, but this Neopier result revealed that Canadians were actually higher in both neuroticism and agreeableness. So, their own characteristics were different from how they perceive people in their countries. McCrae and his colleague then in this study emphasized national character studied exhibit reliability. So, the study was showing reliability, but was not valid regarding national character. What does that basically means? Reliability is about consistency across different aspect of measurement. So, consistently they were people of a country were rating, let us say, perception of themselves to the typical character of their country or nation, that was consistently same, almost everybody were talking about similar thing. So, in that sense it was reliable, consistency was high, such as item on a questionnaire or rating of different individual. Validity on the other hand pertains to the accuracy of this phenomena, but it was not very valid because the accuracy was not there, because they themselves perceive as different from their perception of typical person in their culture. So, the validity was missing, but reliability was high. So, in their study, individuals from many cultures consistently identified a national character of their own country. So, everybody could identify almost similarly of typical person in their culture or country, indicating it is a reliable finding, because everybody was saying the same thing. So, it was a reliable finding. However, this national character did not correspond to the actual personality types of the individuals within those countries, but actual people who were kind of, when they were asked to rate their personality, it was different from their perception. So, the validity was missing because actual characteristics was different. So, this distinction highlights that people may have consistent perception of their national character. This perception do not accurately reflect the true personality traits of individuals in a culture. So, that is kind of the summary of their finding. Perception is very consistent, but actually the people are actually different in terms of when they were measured. Now, so this was another approach. So, configurationalist approach, then national character. Within the national character, one work of particular researcher Hofstede is worth mentioning, because he did very elaborate research on different characteristics of countries, national character. So, one of the key investigator in the study of personality and national culture is this Dutch cultural psychologist. He was also a sociologist, his name is G.H. Hofstede. Hofstede has extensively written on the interaction between national and organizational culture. So, he was studying people in the organizations, big organization like IBM. In 64 countries he collected data and tried to see the interaction between national characteristics and what is the characteristics of the organization within those countries or cultures. So, he conducted a significant research project examining national cultural difference across multinational corporation IBM in 64 countries. So, he collected data and analyzed and tried to find out what are the national characters of different countries by studying people in IBM company in 64 countries. In subsequent work, Hofstede also studied in 23 countries, consumers in 15 countries, airline pilots in 23 countries, civil service managers in 14 countries. So, he extensively studied diverse cultures and countries. Through these studies, he explored how national and regional cultural groups influence the behavior of societies and organizations. So, he was focusing on how people, those culture impacts their behavior in the organization. Hofstede identified initially 4 dimensions of national culture, then later he added one called 5th dimension. So, there are 4 national cultures he found through studying of these people in the different cultures or different countries. One is countries different or cultures differ in something called as power distance, another is uncertainty avoidance, third one is individualism, collectivism. So, these are different characteristics of cultures. Masculinity, femininity, culture may differ, culture may also differ in short term versus long term orientations. So, let us see these 5 dimensions that he found through his research. The first dimension is low versus high power distance. So, some culture are low in power distance, some cultures or countries are high in power distance. What does that basically means? Is this that this dimension measures extent to which less powerful members of a culture or institution within that culture accept and expect that power is distributed equally. What is the belief of people in that in a culture, that to what extent the power is distributed equally or unequally, whether the power is focused or concentrated on few people or it is distributed equally among all people. So, culture differs in that dimensions. So, low power distance culture basically are those countries or cultures. So, in the low power distance culture, in this culture people tend to see each other as equals regardless of formal positions. People in these cultures generally they believe that the power is kind of equally distributed, even though somebody may be high in hierarchy, but generally there is in terms of behavior they perceive less distance and people tend to look or view themselves equal to each other. So, individuals contribute more freely to decision making and processes, and there is a general expectation of equality and shared power. So, power is not only focused on few people only, it is more of an equal distributed. So, there is not much concentrated power on only few people. So, cultures with low power distance are those cultures where people believe, or at least they also experience, that the distribution of power is more or less equal, equally distributed. Hofstede in his research found low power distance culture include Austria, Denmark and New Zealand. These are the countries where power is much more equally distributed as compared to other cultures. So, people experience low power distance. So, more sense of equality among people. The next one is basically within that is high power distance cultures. Some cultures where there is a high power distance. In these cultures, less powerful members accept and expect that power and decision making are concentrated in the hands of few people, or often resulting in more autocratic leadership. So, power is more concentrated on few individuals. So, the people in the power are much more, they are in a very high distance from the people who does not have power. So, distance is very long. So, that is called high power distance cultures. So, there is a higher acceptance also in the hierarchy is much higher in these countries. So, Hofstede found high power distance culture include Malaysia and Slovakia. When he collected data at that time, he found these 2 countries have very high power distance. So, power is concentrated on only few people, and there is a much more less equitable distribution of power. So, this is one dimension where countries can differ in terms of cultural national character. So, some are low power distance cultures or countries, some are high power distance culture or countries. So, this is one dimension where cultures can differ. Second dimension is individualism versus collectivism. So, some cultures are individualistic, some culture are collectivist. So, individualistic culture are those cultures which prioritizes personal freedom, independence and self-reliance. They emphasize personal achievement and goals over group or societal expectation. So, individual focus is more in those cultures where people are more oriented towards their own freedom, their own achievement, independence, self-reliance, autonomy. People kind of focus, people in those countries and cultures focus on their own individual aspects of life. They will focus less on what is going on in the collectively or in the community sense is less. So, Hofstede found examples of individualistic culture are USA, UK, Australia, where individual rights and personal success are highly valued. So, these are the countries where people are more focused on their own life, own independence, own achievement and so on. Sense of community is less in this culture, or at least this is what he found. On the other hand, collectivism culture with collectivism characteristics are just opposite to individualistic. This culture prioritizes interest of group over those of individuals. So, focus is more on group living, communal harmony and so on. They emphasize harmony, cooperation, collective goals and so on. In this culture, individuals are closely integrated into strong cohesive groups and may include family, extended family and social groups. So, the social aspects, interconnection between people, communal living, communal harmony and those kind of things are given much more importance, or they play more important role. Your life may be more oriented what is your connection with other people, what is your relationship with other people, how other people are perceiving you and so on. So, the sense of collectiveness is much stronger in those cultures. So, Hofstede found collectivist culture include countries like Latin American cultures where families and community ties are strong. Group consensus cooperations are valued much more than individual desires and so on. So, sense of collectivism is stronger here. So, some countries, some cultures may differ in the sense of individualism and collectivism. Cultures can also differ in the trait of masculinity and femininity. So, masculine cultures are those cultures where there is a strong emphasis on achievement, success and material rewards. So, these are masculine cultures. Competition and assertiveness are highly valued. Societal roles often reflect this orientation. So, people collectively focus on achievement, success, material rewards, competition, assertiveness, these are valued things in masculine cultures. Individuals are expected to be ambitious and strive for personal goals. So, according to Hofstede, masculine cultures include countries like Japan, where competitiveness, career success are highly prized. So, according to Hofstede, at that time when he collected data, he found Japan is a highly masculine culture. Feminine cultures include cultures which give emphasis on quality of life, relationships, caring for others, cooperation, modesty, compassion are valued over assertiveness and material success. So, these are cooperation, compassion, caring, relationship, those aspects plays more important role in these cultures, feminist culture, feminine cultures. So, individual prioritize the well-being of others and seek harmony in relationship. According to Hofstede, feminine cultures countries are Sweden. He found Sweden as a country where social welfare, equality and quality of life is given a lot of importance. So, some cultures are feminine cultures, some cultures are masculine cultures. The next trait on differences in cultures is uncertainty avoidance. So, some cultures are high on uncertainty avoidance, some cultures are low on uncertainty avoidance. So, what are the characteristics here? Countries with high uncertainty avoidance are cultures with high uncertainty avoidance. There is a strong desire to minimize uncertainty and ambiguity through strict rules, laws and structured societal norms. So, these are the cultures which avoid uncertainties. So, they do not want anything to be uncertain. So, they try to make everything certain by removing ambiguities through strict rules, laws and structured societies norms and so on. So, much more structured and much more rule regulated societies and so on. This culture often rely on traditions, religious beliefs and established practices to provide a sense of security and predictability in life. So, much more rigorous sense of traditions, religious beliefs and established practices, all these things actually provide a sense of certainty in life and security in life. So, examples according to Hofstede of countries with high uncertainty avoidance are again here Japan, Latin America and Mediterranean cultures. So, some of these countries in those regions are high on uncertainty avoidance. So, they want very structured and rule regulated societies. Countries with low uncertainty avoidance are just opposite to the high uncertainty avoidance. So, these cultures are low on uncertainty avoidance, they are open to changes and risk taking. So, they are not so particular about structure and stability and very rule regulated things, they are more open to changes, they take much more risks. Taking risk is you are inviting more uncertainties in life. So, these are the culture, they are more tolerant towards risk taking, they tend to have fewer rules and regulation, governing social behavior and more acceptance of diverse opinions and lifestyle. So, more of openness, less of rules and so on. Individual in this culture may be more comfortable with ambiguity and often more innovative and adaptable to new situations. So, they are more open to changes, more adaptable, they are more innovative because they are not very structured in any way. So, they can kind of mold themselves in various ways. So, according to Hofstede, the cultures with low uncertainty avoidance include a lot of the Scandinavian countries, Anglo-Saxon cultures like USA, UK and so on. These are countries with low uncertainty avoidance. The last one is the long term versus short term orientation. Culture may differ in terms of time orientation. So, this is about to what extent a culture is future oriented and to what extent they are present oriented. So, long term orientation is about long term focus of a culture. So, cultures with a long term orientation prioritize future rewards than immediate gains. So, they focus more on long term goals that are important for their countries and cultures, more future oriented views. They value persistence, perseverance and a sense of regarding. So, basically they are talking about emphasizing importance of planning for the future, investing in education and preparing for long term success. So, more long term focus is there, focusing more for the future and so on. So, according to Hofstede, the examples of culture with long term orientation include China, Japan and many other Asian cultures, where traditions and long range goals are highly valued. So, this is one aspect to it, where some cultures are more oriented towards future goals and so on. On the other hand, short term oriented cultures focus more on immediate gratification and fulfillment of the present need. They value stability, respect for tradition and fulfilling social obligation in the short term. These cultures may prioritize consumerism, quick results and keeping up with current trends. So, these are more like short term, immediate present oriented focus is much more. So, it is more of a relative, that does not mean they do not focus on future. So, they are more focus more in the terms of behaviors and patterns of of the people of those culture is more of a present oriented and immediately what is kind of more gratifying for them and so on. What is the current trend and focusing on that. Examples of those short term oriented cultures are most of these western countries, US and UK, and these are the countries where emphasis is more of immediate result and enjoying the present moment. If you see the people of those countries, they are more of a short term orientation is there. On the other hand, most of these Asian cultures are long term oriented cultures. So, these are some of his findings, and he found that cultures could be distinguished based on all these dimensions. Some culture may be high on certain dimension, low on certain dimension and so on. So, Hofstede actually developed a value survey module or a questionnaire, a tool that was developed to measure cultures on these 5 dimensions of power, distance, individualism, masculinity, femininity, uncertainty and long term short term orientation. Based on that he measured countries or peoples in this orientation, and that is still available and one can use that to understand the cultures. However, Hofstede research was also criticized because no theory is perfect, no research is perfect. So, a lot of researchers actually criticize some of his conceptions and ideas. One is that he proposed kind of static nature of culture, which means the critics are arguing that culture is not so fixed, like you are saying one country is like this and one country. So, the cultures may not be so fixed, and most of these cultures are evolving and dynamic nature is there, there is a constant change, making lot of findings may be potentially outdated over time. So, maybe at that time when he collected data, those characteristics were there in certain countries, but things may change afterwards, because the peoples and the countries and the dimensions, these are all more dynamic and keeps changing. Some authors like Mead contended that Hofstede dimensions offer only a snapshot of a particular time and may not accurately reflect changes of culture that occurs with the passage of time. So, it is more of a reflection of a particular time, how the societies and cultures are. Another criticism is that this research of Hofstede lacks cultural sensitivity, in a sense that Hofstede research often categorizes large regions of like whole East Africa, South Africa as a single cultural entities, disregarding the diversity of cultures within those regions, because he is again this, when talking about culture of a very large group, it is very problematic in a sense. In many cases these are not like one group, there may be many diversity within those regions, those big nations. So, just generalizing one few characteristics of a large group may not be all the time accurate. This oversimplification can lead to misrepresentation of cultural values and behaviors. So, this is another criticism. Third one is people also, researcher find out that there is a sampling issues and biases in the research of Hofstede. Critics like Robinson argue that Hofstede samples are not representative of a broad population or a culture. He collected data primarily from employees of IBM and other multinational corporations, as well as professional like students and airline pilots. So, these are like very highly educated people in a very high level organized jobs. He collected data only from this section of society. So, they may not be representative of this whole culture. These groups tend to have higher socio-economic status and are influenced by Western organizational cultures, potentially biasing the results. So, that is also another possibility that the sample from which he collected data may not be representative of the whole culture where he is generalizing. Another criticism is there can be methodological limitations, like Hofstede methodology relies heavily on self-report questionnaires and data assessed cultural dimension, which may have its own limitations when people report about certain aspects of their cultures. Some argues that relying only on attitudes and perception of people may not capture the actual complexities of the cultures of that particular nation or a region. Many other measurements should be included, like behavioral measures, qualitative methods, etc. Many other ways of collecting data could enhance the validity and so on, which was not there. So, these are some of the limitations of Hofstede study, which kind of limits possibly some of the conclusions that he derived. But despite all these limitations or criticisms, Hofstede terminology in terms of categories of cultures and nations still plays very important role in understanding cultures. Now, at the end we will be talking about there is some differences with the concept of self-constitual. How do you construct your self idea, concept of self? That may also differ from cultures to culture, So, this sense of self-constitual could be connected to the concept of personality. So, we will be just briefly talking about that. So, the way in which we define ourselves, so that is self-constitual. Our self concept is a core aspect of personality and determining factors in behavior. So, it can also shape our personality and influence our personality. So, this self constitual is how people define themselves in relation to others. So, typically this concept is used how we define ourselves in relationship with other people, and this self constitual could be in context of relationship with other, could be independent self constitual or interdependent self constituent. Okay. How do you define yourself? Independently of others or in relation to others, then it is interdependent. So, this concept of self constitual differ from culture to culture also. Research has shown that aspect of self concept can differ substantially from one culture to the another. In particular, the extent to which the self is defined independently, independent of others or interdependent with others vary in different cultures. So, this Mark Marcus and Kitayama, they did lot of research in in this particular context of self-construal. They found cultures differed in this concept of self-construal. How do you define yourself in relation to other people? Differs from culture to culture. So, there is a variation in culture about self-construal. So, they propose this framework to highlight cultural variability of self-construal in terms of understanding the concept of self in different cultures. So, according to Marcus and Kitayama, each individual faces two primary cultural tasks. One is communion, collectivism or interdependence. The task is how individual affiliate with and engages with their larger social groups, how they connect, how they define themselves in relationship to other people in their society. It encompasses relationship with others, adherence to group norms and the sense of belongingness and embeddedness within the community. So, to what extent people define in the context of other people in terms of group norms, in terms of to what extent they feel a sense of belonging to their society or community, or they feel alienated or not. So, sense of interdependence is about that, to what extent you define yourself in connection with other people, in terms of relationship with other people, to what extent you accept the group norms, you feel sense of belongingness. So, that is interdependence. Agency, individualism or independence is about, this is the task to pertain individuals, how they differentiate themselves from others. It includes the development and expression of unique abilities, personal motivations, personality traits that distinguish individuals from other groups. To what extent you also define yourself as independent from other in terms of your own personal characteristics, personal motivation, personal life, personal unique abilities and so on. So, culture may differ in terms of this self-construal. One is interdependent, one is independent. Marcus and Kitayama argued that these two cultural tasks vary significantly in different cultures. Some cultures are more towards interdependent orientation, some are more towards independent orientations. So, some cultures emphasize interdependence and communal values. So, that is more of a, they look themselves, their identity is more connected to the relationship with other people in the community, where individuals derive their sense of self from the roles and relationship with the group. In contrast, other cultures prioritize independence and individualistic values, where person autonomy and uniqueness emphasized in defining themselves. So, this is how these two dimensions differ. Marcus and Kitayama, they basically found in most of these Western individualistic cultures, most of these Western countries are individualistic oriented cultures like Canada and UK. They emphasis is placed on independence and an independent self-construal. Here individuals prioritize personal goals, autonomy and uniqueness. Most of the people in those cultures, they define themselves more often independently. In contrast, many non-Western collectivist cultures such as Japan and China emphasize interdependence and interdependent self-construal. In these cultures, the focus shifts from group to group harmony, social roles and interconnectedness. In those cultures, people define themselves more, or they derive their identity more in their relationship with other people in their community and society, more like what is their social roles, how much importance they give to group harmony or interconnectedness with the people. This is how they define themselves more. So, some cultures are more individualistic, more independent culture, some are more of an interdependent or collectivist culture in that sense. So, the difference is how they define themselves. For example, in the study, one of the study done by Marcus and Kitayama compared how Japanese and European students describe themselves using different attributes. He just asked students from different two cultures, one is Japanese student, one is European countries student, and they try to see how they define themselves, what kind of attributes or characteristics they say when they are asked to define themselves. They found that a significant cultural difference existed in their self description. More specifically, they found 84% of Japanese students describe themselves as ordinary. In the same context, only 18% of American students use this term. So, more of Japanese people define themselves as an ordinary individual, but very few individuals from the American country, only 18% define themselves using this term. On the other hand, they found about 96% of American students describe themselves as special, whereas only 55% of Japanese students use this term to describe themselves. So, what kind of terms are used by people in different cultures differed here very specifically. So, this finding clearly highlights the contrasting cultural norms in self-constitutional, how self is defined. Japanese culture emphasizes humility, modesty and fitting with the group. Hence, the higher percentage of students describe themselves as ordinary, because they see more of a identity of a group identity rather than they themselves as somebody special. So, they use more of an ordinary as a description. In contrast, American culture tends to emphasize individuality, uniqueness and standing out from the crowd, which gets reflected in the higher percentage of students describing themselves as special. So, because that is what is focused in their culture. So, they describe themselves more with these terms. So, this is kind of findings of different terminology used by European Americans and Japanese student. So, there is a clear differences in terms of highest percentages used by for different terms. So, it is a very clear sharp difference between if you see the Japanese student, they use more of emotions related to so very few, only 84% used ordinary as a term, and if you see here special, 96% say it as a special here. So, there are certain differences they found, which shows a very clear cultural difference. So, in summary, research provides an empirical support or evidence that individuals in different cultures possibly have different self concepts because of the cultural environment. So, this is how we define ourselves very differently based on what kind of cultural environment we are exposed to. So, these self concepts are typically transmitted from parents to teachers to children within the cultural context. Some critics like Matsumoto and others also argue that this Western self constitutes as strictly independent and Asian as strictly self constitutional is interdependent may be problematic, because again the problem is they say the cultural difference in self constitutional is more of a matter of a degree than actual differences. So, in terms of degrees, certain culture may be more towards interdependent description self constitutional and some towards more independent constitutional. They may not be clear cut, such dichotomies may not be very feasible and very good way to kind of depict, rather than it is more of a degree differences. So, some criticism is also there in that regard. Moreover, also studies found that individuals may alter their self concept when they move to a new culture. So, the self constitutional may not be so fixed. When they go to another culture, they change their description of self constitutional when they move to new cultures, gradually aligning more with the norms and values of a new environment over time. Furthermore, within any society, certain individuals may exhibit self concepts and identities that diverge significantly from those of broader population. Obviously, those individual few exceptions will always be there. When we talk about one culture, everybody may not be same. There may be people in the culture where most people may describe in certain way, but there may be many exceptions who describe themselves different from majority of the people. So, this variability underscores the dynamic nature of self concept. So, self concept may be very dynamic. So, a lot of these theories, the problem sometimes happens when you take those identities and ideas and very fixed, because things may change. So, with that understanding, obviously all this concept can be useful, but one should understand that cultures, people's identities, people's self conception all can change, and because of their dynamic nature. So, these are some of the ideas that are related to how culture can be connected to the concept of personality. So, with this I will stop here. Thank you.